This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sign.
Just as we move through today's business, we've received apologies from Mr. Hazard. Are members aware of any other apologies at this stage? No. Okay. Just chairperson's business. Just in relation to early years allocations, obviously stage one of the preschool admissions process has concluded, and we saw the minister's press statement, which has stated that 95% of children have been placed, and some of the parents, however, are some of the placements are not to parents' satisfaction. So there is actually some issue around this, I think, locally around various constituencies. So if members are content that we do write to the department just to seek confirmation around its treatment of all preschool provision. I know that sort of perhaps in the absence of Mr. McCausland, who raised this with me, he had concerns around some of the schools or the options which were being offered to parents in his constituency. So I suppose it's really just to look at how that's being treated by the department and get some feedback from them.
Yes, Chair. I totally agree with you on that one, because I'm getting complaints from parents. They've been offered, and I think there's no question about it, they've been offered, but their offer is literally 10-15 mile away from where they actually live.
45.
You know, yeah, you're getting ridiculous incidents of offers, made, some of them completely outside of the local council area, never mind anything else. So it's, yes, they're ticking boxes, but they're not actually fulfilling local needs, and I think that needs to be emphasised.
Mr. Newton?
No,
Mr. Kinnan?
agree with. I think we do need to ask them, but what's still coming to me is the working couple are still having a problem, and I think one school, not even in my patch, that rang me yesterday, 85 people in the queue, and there was someone who needed desperately to get to. They saw as their local school.
So it's maybe not just as it seems.
Yeah, there's a whole mass of things.
So I think if members are content, then we do explore this more with the department.
I wonder, is it possible to get a breakdown of the statistics? Say, for example, children that have been offered a place within 3 miles or 5 miles,
Yeah, we can ask that question.
as opposed to children who have been offered a place.
More meaningful.
I mean, the same school, when I asked, and they gave me the numbers for his reasoning going down the line, and it was sort of 16 because they had family members, and then 5 because they were governors or teachers in the school, family and others. It was fascinating. Before you actually got to the working couples that weren't special needs or any of the other categories, it only left 5 spaces. But it then links into our whole area planning process of where we're meant to have all these empty seats.
Are members content we do that? I met with the Deaf Youth Forum last week, and they're planning to launch their manifesto on the 18th of May, and certainly members will be receiving an invitation to that launch. But just during those discussions, they talked about a pilot GCSE for sign language. So I'm just wanting to know whether members are content that we perhaps contact SIA to ask about that pilot. Where it's taking place, but also just in relation to whether or not they would consider then rolling that out as an offering. There's also there's a written question to the department, and in the response from the department, they talked about ETI and how they had not supported a number of development proposals. I mean, that's clearly at odds with what we had heard before with regards to what ETI's input is into development proposals. So if members are content that we contact the department just to seek clarification as to what their position is in the process.
Yep.
If you're happy enough that we do that. There was also the Belfast Telegraph ran a report with regards to safety on school buses. So if members are content that we contact the department in relation to that, just to explore actually what the extent of the defects were I know that we used to do this quite regularly in the department, or in the committee, with regards to school safety on school pupil safety on buses, but if we could just contact them with regards to that report. Moving then to the minutes of the meeting of the 15th of April at page 119, if members are content that this is an accurate record of proceedings.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much. Matters arising. We've correspondence in from the Committee for Health, the Clerk's cover notes at page 128. This is from the committee in respect of the committee stage of our SEND bill. So if you're content that we note that correspondence just in anticipation for our committee stage of the bill. We'll move then to our written briefing on the review of Sure Start, and just refer members to the Clerk's cover note at page 131 and to the RSM McClure Waters report on the independent review of the Sure Start programme. And can I just ask Peter just to speak to the papers, please?
Thanks, Chairperson. As members will recall, the Minister referenced this review report when he briefed on the budget in March. The Department actually sent it to us last week. So the Department has asked the committee not publish the relevant paperwork at this time, as the Minister is still considering the recommendations. But the review deals with Sure Start. As members are aware, that's a preschool programme funded by DE, delivered by the Health and Social Care Board in partnership with the child care partnerships that organise early years provision. Costs about £24 million per annum, delivered through 39 projects in the 20% most deprived wards, and this is being rolled out to the 25% most deprived wards. Services within those wards are universal, that is open to everyone who lives in the ward, and they are often, though not always, obviously education related. So some of them are very obviously education related, some less so, and they often go by different names. So for example, the developmental programme for 2 to 3 year olds, which is very popular and actually quite expensive as well, appears to have what you might call a non-identical twin called Incredible Years, which I know members are aware of. So there's a number of variants. You may be aware of projects in your constituencies under Sure Start. Might have slightly different names, may actually be rather similar. So the review indicates that outcome measurement for Sure Start needs to be standardised and improved. However, the overall findings are that feedback is very positive on the effectiveness of Sure Start. There's a question about whether target families, etc., are always reached. So what it says is services are there where they should be, so right services for the right profile of population. But there was a question about whether particular families in need are always getting access to the thing that they need. And in particular, they give the example of looked after children or children living in temporary accommodation, not necessarily getting the services that they may benefit from. So costs for projects like this, not surprisingly, 74% are staff costs, as this is much smaller accommodation cost. The report recommends an ETI longitudinal study, so this would be about finding a bunch of Sure Start children and then following them through to see what benefit the programme actually brings to them. It notes the development by DE of an outcome framework. So the report's a little critical about the way in which Sure Start is assessed, but suggests, notes that DE is already about this and trying to develop an outcome framework so that you can assess the impact of the programme. It recommends that DE have a presence on all Sure Start management committees to make sure that the educational content of the programmes is always there. And it appears to recommend that DE should consider, owing to financial constraints, not rolling out all of the services to the extra wards, but should instead make some of the key educational services available beyond the Sure Start areas on a non-universal basis. So this is particularly around, I think, the developmental programme for their 2 to 3 year olds. It is expensive. It's a couple of grand per child, which is quite expensive. But what their suggestion was that there may be groups, for example, looked after children, not necessarily living in the Sure Start 20% or 25% wards, who would benefit, and that what they're suggesting is the department think about devising admission criteria to make sure that these children get access. So it's a very long report. It does say quite a lot about Sure Start, but the overall findings were that it is actually very positive and having a good impact.
And have we received any indication from the department with regards to the recommendations which are contained within the report?
The ministers, I think the department in their covering letter, I think, have indicated that the minister is still considering those recommendations. I don't think it's been very long produced, actually. And there is a lot in it. It's 230 pages, so no, not yet.
Okay, so committee could obviously then write to the minister with regards to the report, and asking for his early sort of consideration of it, and a sort of timescale perhaps on when he conclude those deliberations.
Yeah, if I might, I mean, thank you. It probably highlights as well, I mean, it's a very complex governance system within Sure Start, and I'd be familiar with a lot of the work that goes on in my own constituency, but, you know, I'm just noting it sits within DE, then it's administered again within the health board, and very complex kind of children's partnership arrangements. And I think one of the challenges here is, where do children and young people's services sit? And, you know, the conversation around the restructuring of departments and opportunities there. And I think that does bring up then the whole debate around formal cooperation between education and health. Because I think that's one of the things that's coming out of the report, that, and maybe we just should seek a view as to those governance arrangements, a view from the department as to how best they could be obviously made robust but made less complex.
And while this report was commissioned by the Department of Education, I just wonder how much sharing there has been with the Department of Health. So it perhaps might be useful just to get that type of information. And I know that it's been requested that we don't publish this on our website, but would it be possible for us to share it with the Committee for Health?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other members with regards to this,
and I
Mr.
suppose
Rogers?
really following on from that too, with that sort of complex governance of two departments, you know, is there money tied up there that could actually be delivered at the chalk face in terms of Sure Start? Because that's a major concern of mine, that with less money, okay, it's 1 million out of 25 million is a 4% cut roughly, but that's going to mean, and is so heavily dependent on staff, and I'm just thinking of Sure Start programme in my own area, it's going to mean less staff, which means less children, and at the same time we're trying to increase this to the wards that are 25% level of deprivation. So there's are less families going to be able to avail of this when we spread it out and with less money? How are we going to manage that? Is there any way we can tighten up the governance in some other way that the money goes to the right place?
Just looking at the administrative costs.
It's the same sort of idea. I mean, if you read through this, there's a lot of recommendations of more strategy and less action. I wonder whether we shouldn't be asking for a very small team to actually come in and to actually make the things happen. So a small action team that is looking at simplifying the governance and putting it in place, rather than just writing a report. It worries me that you've got a cut coming in and then we're actually going to spend more on how are we going to do it in the future without actually doing it. I don't know how do we get there. Is there a way of recommending a sort of ongoing action team that simplified?
How far away are we from getting a briefing on this from?
Good question.
Because those are the type of questions which would be really useful to put to officials.
I would anticipate that they're not ready to brief us on this because the Minister is still considering the recommendations, so that when we write to them we could seek a briefing, indicate concerns, highlight particularly the views that the committee has around the governance, and maybe suggest, well, ask whether as part of the reorganisation of the departments, whether this is going to be part of that, because children's services are supposed to, if I understand correctly, more children's services are to come to the department, so there may be an opportunity to simplify governance.
we're obviously also in the mix of having a reduction in the early years fund as well, which isn't totally separate from all of this, because you're providing to communities who are very much in need of assistance. So it would be useful to have as much information as we can on the way forward, including what will happen post-August with early years funding. Members, any other comments with regards to that? Okay, thank you. Moving then to our next written briefing, which is ETI evaluation, special educational needs capacity building, pilot, early years settings. The clerk's note, cover note is at page 367. Just refer you to the evaluation just after that. So again, can I ask Peter just to make comment just on the papers, please?
Thanks, Chair. So as members are aware, there's been an increase in children presenting with special educational needs in schools. So on average, it seems to be around about 20% of children have SEN. Information was actually tabled last week from the department in connection with the SEND bill, and at the back of it there was the equality screening. And there are just some numbers in there. I mean, in terms of children with SEN, it's about 2 to 1 boys to girls. About 60% of all looked after children have special educational needs. There's a high percentage of travellers, and there's actually a low percentage of newcomer children, maybe owing to language barriers, and it's, as you might expect, equal between Protestants and Catholics in terms of special educational need. One of the other sort of interesting things was that children in nursery schools have an average level of SEN. So on average, 20% of children in nursery schools special educational need, but children at voluntary or private earlier settings have a very much lower level of special educational need. The reason, I think in the report from ETI, is apparently owing to limited capacity to detect. So as you can see in the report which is appended, ETI found that the staff in those private and some of the voluntary ones had no SEN identification training. So ETI had undertaken a number of reviews on this subject, made a series of recommendations over a few years. In response, DE undertook a 3-year SEN capacity building project for 170 early year settings across Northern Ireland from 2011-12 to 2014-15, and they spent $6.5 million. ETI then reviewed, and the ETI report is at page 371. ETI speaks in its report of unacceptably low progress in the past, replaced now by this very good capacity building scheme, and the review of it is very positive. ETI recommended a network of SEN hubs, a mainstream programme of capacity building, and they also recommended the formalisation of the transition from early years to primary schools, and the idea being to capture, well, they felt that information was being lost, developmental information that they got in early years was not making its way into the foundation years of primary schools. And they also they talked about, or they recommended, a new approach to the recording of key information and improving communication between professionals. Again, something that I think I remember mentioned last week, as I recall. There's also a reference in the report to a review of the practice of prioritising referrals in primary school and the provision of specialist support in reasonable timescales. It's just all of the other stuff, as I was saying to the chair yesterday, they basically say the same thing several times over, as you do in a good report, but then there's this line about prioritising referrals in primary schools and the provision of specialist support in reasonable timescales, which I didn't quite understand. I think I know what they're getting at, but the background to it was not quite clear. So, Chair, that's a very brief summary of the ETI report.
Okay, well, it might be useful then to seek clarification just from the department on that. And again, I suppose this is something else which we would need to contact the Minister with regards to the recommendations and where they're currently sitting within his department and as a priority for him. There are a number of things there which obviously require cost. Particularly if the pilot costs $6.5 million, and if this were to be mainstreamed, then what the cost of that would be moving forward. So there are probably some questions that we maybe need to ask in and around that, but it would be useful to see where this is currently sitting with the department and the next steps for action
Thanks, Chair. You know, there's nothing in there that I actually disagree with, to be honest with you, but especially on this thing about, you know, transferring information and files over from the primary to secondary sector, there is a big issue there because very few, you know, schools of any description do that, especially around special educational needs. There is another hidden difficulty in there, and Peter, if you've looked at this report, you can maybe give us an indication, has this been looked at? When pupils transfer between secondary schools of any description, there is also a big issue there in that a lot of the schools do not transfer even the pupil profile or files that they have on the pupils over to the other school.
Or where they go to FE.
Sorry?
Or where they go to FE.
Or, yes, as Robin quite rightly points out, it's also an issue in FE around transferring that sort of information. And that has a detrimental impact on the education of the individual child. Was there anything in the recommendations around that?
The report only deals with preschool, but I think as the member will recall, the CYPSP, the Children and Young People's Strategic Programme, looked at...
It would also, Peter, apply to the primary sector. It's the same practice throughout the system.
I think they talk about individual learner records and the idea of the individual learner numbers, but it may be something we could take up with the department to see. But no, the report in question deals only with preschool. But I think there has been work done on this, so it might be interesting to see.
But even in the preschool sector, Peter, the same practice is there. They don't share. You know, whether it's intentional or not.
I think this is an invaluable piece of work, and I would hope that we would have an opportunity to take it a wee bit further with the department. No?
Again, I suppose in the correspondence we
terms
can
of
ask as to
coming
when
here,
we
yeah.
can have officials up to brief us on it,
Yeah.
and just to explore where they're going from there.
Can we explore Peter's point about the provision of specialist support and reasonable timescales?
Yeah.
Because the main issue I'm really getting is
A lot of people
Yeah.
you're getting.
this gets delayed. And then a one shot.
I think that's
Obviously,
we put that within the correspondence to them, just to seek clarification around that. Any other comments with regards to the report? Okay, thank you very much. Moving then on to the departmental briefing on school starting age. Just refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 410 and to other relevant papers. And welcome to committee Dr. David Hughes, Director of Curriculum Qualifications and Standards from the department, Dale Heaney, who is Head of Assessment and Qualifications team, Heather Robinson, who is Head of Early Years Preschool team, and Florence McCaw, Transfer Officer at the South Eastern Education and Library Board. Good morning, you're very welcome to committee, and can I ask you to make an opening statement and members will then follow up with some questions.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to update the committee today. As you're aware, the consultation on the proposals around deferral of school starting age was launched in mid-December and concluded on the 6th of March. And arrangements for the consultation were put in place to ensure that the views of all relevant stakeholders were taken into account. There was a web survey available on the department's website through which 296 responses were received, and overall the majority of respondents were online. 56 responses received either by email or through the post. The majority of responses received from parents, 198 overall, about 68%, of which over half were parents of children whom they felt would probably be eligible for deferred entry under an arrangement. So I don't think it's surprising to us, certainly, that there was this high number of responses from parents who had a particular interest in the subject, but of course that does mean that the overall statistics, if we take the statistics out of it, will have a high impact of that kind of makeup of responses. So I'll just run through sort of highlights of the responses to the consultation. The first question, in responses to the first question, respondents were very strongly in favour of there being a process of deferral in place. So almost 94% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that a parent should be able to apply to defer his or her child's school starting age. On question 2, in terms of the principles that should be followed, almost 99% of respondents agreed that the needs of the child would be paramount. 69.4% of respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed that deferral should be in exceptional circumstances only. Views were more mixed in relation to the necessity to provide evidence to support a case for deferral. 51.5% disagreed or strongly disagreed that evidence should be provided, and 38.5% agreed or strongly agreed that they should, with 10% undecided. In terms of question 3 and the options around preschool, the majority of respondents agreed that a preschool place should be available to the deferred child in their current preschool setting and for those applying for the first time or wanting a new setting. 88.6% agreed that a parent must apply for a preschool place through the open enrolment process. 69.2% agreed that parents could opt not to apply for a preschool place in the deferred year. Questions 4 and 5 cover the priority of the deferred child in respect of other children in terms of preschool places. Question 4, there's a mixture of views expressed, but essentially 57.1%, the largest percentage, favoured giving priority to the deferred child over a 2-year-old child applying for preschool. The next largest group, 17.6%, felt that the deferred child should have no priority over any others. Question 5A, we propose the offer of a primary school place should be withdrawn if deferral is agreed by the proposed expert panel. 54.2% of respondents agreed with this, with 45.8% disagreeing. Question 5B drew very significant support where the parent was asked to confirm within a specified time frame they accept deferral before the primary school place is withdrawn. Those opposed to this particular proposal felt that the primary school place should be held for 1 year until the deferred child was ready to start primary school. Question 5C, where a parent changes his or her mind about deferral, it's proposed that they should apply for year 1 of primary school after the open enrolment process had concluded, and 88% agreed. And question 5D, 85.8% agreed or strongly agreed with the proposal that applications to year 1 of primary school following a year of deferral should be open, as is currently the case. There's a very small number of negative responses from the 4 responses of this type, actually from primary and nursery schools, who expressed concern that the proposals could lead to increased numbers of parents deferring their children's entry to primary school when it's not in their child's best interests to do so, and also flagging the uncertainty for schools that would lead to. In addition to the survey, and to take account of the views of young people, colleagues undertook 5 workshops with GCSE and A-level students to ascertain their views on these proposals. This engagement provided some very interesting results. The main reason for engaging with pupils of this age was that, having read a number of research reports on the issue, we were interested in establishing if the differential in terms of readiness for school was felt then to have dissipated by the time students reach GCSE A-level study years. We actually found that young people were quite sceptical of the need for deferral, although over 77% agree that deferral should be available. The majority of students also agree that it should be in exceptional circumstances only, and that parents should provide evidence. We're particularly interested to know whether students thought that their month of birth had a detrimental impact on pupils' performance relative to their older peers. And the majority, 81.2%, felt that the youngest people in a year group were not disadvantaged, and absolutely recognising this is not a representative group of a cohort, students we met noted that those with May or June birthdays could well be top of their class. In order to ensure the views of parents were especially engaged, we got Parenting NI to carry out their own web survey and focus groups. Results of this work largely replicated the results of the departmental web survey, although there were some differences, as is highlighted in your briefing papers. The main difference being that 79% of parents in the parenting NI focus groups felt that evidence should be required to support a parent's case for deferral. However, it's worth noting the numbers engaged in this format were very low. We also engaged Playboard to undertake focus groups with younger children in years 1 to 7 in primary school. Again, the results from the Playboard consultation highlighted that the children whom Playboard engaged agreed that parents should be able to apply to defer. They also agree that deferral should be for a good reason, and agree that parents should have to make the case for deferral. So those are really the key findings from the consultation exercise. The committee will also be aware the Minister has decided that the legislation to bring a process of deferral into place won't proceed in the current Assembly mandate due to other legislative priorities. And I think we all recognise this is regrettable, and I know those with particular interest in this policy will be disappointed. But as a result of calls from parents for clarity on the issue, guidance on issues around school starting will come out in due course. This guidance would cover a range of issues associated with school starting age, including advice for parents who are worried their child is not ready to start school. So that's a summary of the consultation responses and the position on the legislation. I'm very happy to answer questions and colleagues to answer questions, providing any further detail that the committee may be looking for.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that briefing. Obviously, we had received correspondence and indication from the Minister that he was inclined to bring this forward during this mandate, and obviously the committee felt that we would be able to facilitate that within the timescales. Is the reason you're not bringing it forward purely administrative? I mean, is it because of the timescale that you feel that you're not going to be able to get it done, or is there another obstacle in the way?
No, it's a matter of the prioritisation of the legislative opportunities in the time remaining in the mandate.
And were you not aware of that pre going out to consultation?
Yes, I think we were very conscious of the very tight deadlines that we were working to. Having said that, we felt it was important to have a 12-week consultation, and that we went to the efforts that we did to engage across a number of different sectors, as David has outlined. So the capacity for slippage was huge in terms of getting clearance, first of all, from the Minister, from yourselves through this process, and then ultimately executive clearance to have the legislation drafted. But when we look at the timetable in terms of the legislative process for the Assembly and then the committee scrutiny, it really doesn't seem to allow sufficient time for that process to be followed. And then regrettably the Minister looked at those other legislative priorities and decided which was his priorities as a consequence of that. So.
Unfortunately, putting out the consultation has raised an expectation,
yes,
which now hasn't been met. I know that you've indicated that you will put out guidance with regards to what the current position is. When will that take place, or when will that be published?
Well, we've already written to the Education Authority and asked to meet with them to walk through what the guidance might cover and the detail of that. So we hope to make progress quite quickly. As to how long it might take, it's still to say, because there's not just the policy context that needs to be set out, but also the operational aspects. We certainly don't feel we're close enough to those operational aspects to be able to outline those in detail. So I think between the two, the Department and the Education Authority, we hope to make progress relatively quickly. As to whether it will be finalised, I couldn't say exactly. But we're conscious that there is an expectation out there, and we're keen to try and meet that requirement as soon as possible.
I think it's worth saying that the timescales for the production of that guidance is one of the first questions that will need to be addressed in that dialogue between the department and the Education Authority, because we will need to take advice from them as to the time it will take for their input, for our input, and to bring it together. The point you make about having launched a policy consultation when there was the risk that the legislation may not be able to follow. I recognise the point you make, but I think actually we would say that the consultation has been enormously valuable in bringing to the department's attention the views of those who want to engage in this subject, bringing to our attention a lot more factors and issues that need to be taken on board. So actually, having done that consultation, even putting in place the renewed guidance around this issue, we will need to be able to we'll be able to take into account some of the views and some of the important contributions made through the consultation exercise. So it is important, and I don't think it's sort of the wrong decision to have taken to have launched a consultation that way.
I'm slightly confused because it was my understanding that it was currently possible to defer school starting age, and parents were just seeking that sort of clarification, particularly for principals. So what you're talking about is renewed guidance. Will that be changing what the current position is?
I think we would need to make sure that the guidance set out very clearly what is possible and what is not possible, because what considerations have to be given to excuse me, what considerations have to be given by parents, schools, the education authority when the question of deferring school starting arises, and that is work that will need to be worked through in considerable detail to ensure that the guidance doesn't leave any ambiguity, and that there is a unified practice and uniform practice.
So if that is the case, is there a need for legislation?
Well, certainly, that's the advice that we have seen from our Departmental Solicitor's Office, and on the basis of that advice, yes, that is certainly what we feel is needed, particularly to provide a clear way for deferral in the way that the Minister has said he wants it outlined, which is in exceptional circumstances.
But if you can provide guidance, why then do you need legislation?
But the guidance will set out what is possible within the context of the current legislation, because we're not changing the legislation. So we're not achieving the same ends as we would be achieving by introducing legislation. We would, however, be bringing clarity to the current situation.
And I accept that, but as it currently stands, parents can still defer the school starting age of their child.
Well, if that does happen, and we've met with the lobby group, which has that particular view, those tend to be in very unique circumstances and are totally dependent on private arrangements that those parents have made. So the sort of numbers that you're talking about are literally a handful, if that, over the last number of years. So we're talking about tiny numbers. So, you know, if guidance was to include that sort of opportunity, it would have to be done in the context of the other pieces of legislation, which say very clearly what age ranges are allowed to attend primary school or nursery school rather, and what aren't. So it is rather a complicated area, and I think certainly the message I've taken from the comments that we've shared with the committee in terms of what parents' views are on this issue is that from a parent's point of view, any guidance that would provide clarity from their perspective would be helpful. So I think that's what we're keen that this proposed guidance would deliver, that it would provide clarity on an issue that is at times quite complicated for a non-civil servant or non-bureaucrat to interpret.
I suppose from my perspective and dealing with parents who have children who they believe wouldn't be able to meet the requirements perhaps of a P1 year, be it through communication issues or whatever, that were they to be held back, that they would still be in a setting which would be appropriate for them, which would then assist them to be ready for a school year. So it's about making sure that the preschool availability is there as well in order to assist the parents and the child.
Yes, and if that were to happen, that's where we understand legislation would be required to enable that to happen. So the guidance that David has referred to has to be clear about what's possible within the current legislation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kinahan.
Lovely, thank you. And I too was confused to see how there's no flexibility, but at the same time you can do guidance. And I wondered, are there things that we can do without legislation and therefore could put in place, or does the special needs bill come in, give us an avenue to maybe put something in that opens the door to a little bit more flexibility? Is there other things that we can do in the short term rather than sit and wait for full-scale legislation?
Well, I think, taking your second point first, I mean, I think the SEN bill is an SEN bill. And I think what's been very important is a point that's been made both by those outside the system who are looking at school starting and those within the education sector, is what we're not talking about here is special educational needs. So I think there needs to be a distinction there. I think the importance of the guidance is saying currently the legislative framework is such, explaining and setting out the guidance how that legislative framework needs to be interpreted, so that there's a common understanding. And it may well be that it clarifies where decisions need to be taken, who is able to take decisions in respect of schools starting, and what the consequences of those might be, but not taken just in isolation from all the other issues which arise. That degree of clarity is something which I think, quite rightly, parents should expect. I mean, I don't pretend that DE circulars or guidance are very easy things to swallow at the best of times. But in this one, it's very important that parents do understand precisely what the situation is that they are in. But in order to put into place exactly the policy objectives and the policy proposals, rather, that were set out in that consultation, there would need to be legislation. So there is things can be done to make the situation clearer and hopefully easier for parents to understand what the options are, short of actually changing the legislative framework. And I think that's very important. And I think it's a matter of regret that legislation has not been taken forward. I think if we were in a different sort of stage in the Assembly's mandate, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So we will want to put something in place that is helpful.
So then, on the back of all that, accelerated legislation isn't possible. You've not got time, given all the other things that are going through. That means there's absolutely no way.
As I understand, that that decision has been taken.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lunn.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your presentation. David, I'm interested in the timescales here. From when the Minister agreed in a letter to Mervyn Story that he was prepared to look at options, it seems to have taken 15 months to even bring forward the consultation. Would that be a normal case of work? I mean, it seems like an awful long time to bring forward a consultation on something which isn't particularly complicated. Why does it take so long?
I would say that actually it is quite a complicated issue when it comes to legislation and practical arrangements and consequences of making a change in this area. I think at the core of it, it's a very simple and straightforward idea, but actually working through the consequences and working through the options and working through the consequences of all the options and looking at a body of research and looking at what other jurisdictions are doing and engaging with partners in other parts of the education system, it actually has been quite an extended and intensive piece of work. As it were, the consultation document and the questions that it asks and the sort of the model that it sets out and seeks views on doesn't really do justice to the number of issues and the amount of work that's had to go in to get to that stage. So I recognise the point you make. It hasn't been a swift turnaround, but I think that's as a consequence that the simple idea of deferring a child's starting P1 actually does have significant consequences apart from that decision being taken for that child.
Okay. I hear all that, I still don't understand how it can take 15 months to put together what I consider to be a relatively simple series of consultation questions. But the analysis of the consultation, I would accept, needs to be done very constructively and carefully, but we'll leave that. Your main point is that there's not going to be time in this mandate to progress legislation.
So I suppose I have a couple of questions about that. I mean, how complicated would, I'm a simple man, you know, how complicated would the legislation need to be if changes were recommended? And are you worried about departmental time or committee time or assembly time? Is this a problem within the department that you can't bring forward legislation fairly quickly?
My understanding is the decision around how as it were, the weight of legislation being brought to the Assembly, we, as it were, have been given the answer without having been party to the internal consideration of what the workload of the Assembly is in this area. I apologise for not being able to give you a clear answer on that one, because that's not where we've had our attention. In terms of the size of the legislation, Dale may be able to give more detail.
Oh, I think as part of the discussions that we've had over those 15 months, yes, it does bring into question some other issues, including the age of the child when he or she leaves school, for example, which may not be an immediate question that comes to mind, but certainly was part of our discussions in thinking about what are the ramifications for this, what are the repercussions, not just for DE, but including other departments. So there's a whole range of discussions that have taken place that needed to potentially feature in a legislative bill to follow. So whilst it's rather academic to say precisely what might go into the bill going forward, certainly the legislation, first of all, to allow a process for application, for example, needs to feature the age at which a child might then be able to remain in preschool, for example, would also need to be considered. The process of applications and how they're scrutinised, if there's going to be an exceptional panel, for example, what would that look like? Well, what would exceptional circumstances look like? How long or how short might that list be? Who would the members of the panel consist of? From which bodies and so on might they be taken? Would they be remunerated or non-remunerated? And so on. That's a quick run through sort of some of the questions, I guess, that our debates internally have taken, and some of those may or may not feature on that eventual bill to follow, depending on what the Minister ultimately decides.
Has any preparatory work been done?
Yes. I mean, we have worked in conscious of the very tight time.
A lot of that preparatory work for the items you've described there is already in place?
We've certainly had discussions at a high level in terms of what the sort of areas we might need to cover. Obviously, the Minister has made his decision because his legislative priorities are as he has outlined in his letter to you. But unfortunately, I think it's a combination of the time needed for scrutiny by the Assembly, approval by the Executive prior to that, and then scrutiny by the Committee, together with the reductions in staffing within DE. So it's really all three elements that have resulted in that decision.
Well, you don't need to particularly comment on this, but this is supposed to be a legislative assembly. We spend an awful lot of time, because of the lack of legislation, dealing with sometimes fairly irrelevant or pointless private members' motions. It seems to me, I must say, on the record, that there's plenty of time in the Assembly timetable for more legislation, especially for something which, go back to, it doesn't sound all that complicated. Now, there's been pressure for years from parents to deal with this situation. The committee, I believe, is pretty much unanimous on the need or the desirability of dealing with it, and the Minister has tacitly agreed that he would like to deal with it. And I believe that the Assembly has time to deal with it. So you're kind of blaming Assembly time. I'm blaming departmental time, or departmental disinclination, let's say, to bring this forward. And I accept that there's other bills in the education sector pending, but you just have to query whether there's and you say there isn't sufficient time. I think we would perhaps say that there is.
Can I also ask, just before I bring Mr. Rogers in, that you've obviously done some extensive work, or you say you've done quite extensive work on this. Have you costed a model at this stage?
In terms of what the cost of operating
Of operation.
a process of deferral, again, that's where things become very difficult to tie down in terms of predicting the numbers that might apply and might then be successful for deferral. Certainly, we looked at other systems, particularly in Scotland, where we felt there was some close parallels. And one of the questions within the consultation that we asked was to try and elicit what level of support might there be, a level of interest in applying for deferral. The numbers range between anywhere from 100 applications, because that's the number, for example, that, of parents who said they would apply. I think it was under question 7, if deferral was an option. And that's a similar sort of number to some of the authorities that Scotland has to deal with, depending on their size, up to potentially 500 if you were to apply a sort of percentage that the deferral process in Scotland elicits overall. Again, it's very difficult to determine then what might that mean in practice, particularly if we're going to go through an exceptional panel process. Do we build it on the basis of 500 applications per annum, which would be a significant amount of work, or do you base it on the basis of minimum 100? So we've looked very initially at what that might mean in terms of numbers of panels, for example, and the number of experts then you would need to involve in that process. But it's very much at the initial stage. And yes, we're very conscious that it would be great to be able to tie those down more closely. But unfortunately, the consultation didn't elicit a very clear view or a very reliable way in which we could say, yes, it's going to be 100 and no more. It's the sort of thing that, I guess, depending if it is to be promoted quite actively by the department and say this is now available, again, that may elicit a greater number of parents being interested. So at the moment, we're talking about ranges of numbers. And yes, there will be some cost to that, depending on whether remuneration is involved for the panel member.
Mr. Rogers.
Thanks, Chair, and you're very welcome. And just following on from Trevor's point, I just feel very, very disappointed about this, because this is not on the department's radar for 18 months. It's on the department's radar since 2008, because a group of parents who are passionate about it had requested a meeting with the Minister at that stage. Mind they didn't get a meeting, so on. So maybe could I explore the not enough time a wee bit more? Did the department seek advice from Assembly officials in terms of the ability of this institution to deal with the legislation?
I'm sorry, we're not in, because we're coming from the policy position rather than from the business management side. I'm afraid I'm probably not in a position to say how the decisions were made around the management of Assembly business in respect of the different departments and the amount of legislation that had been scheduled for this last year of this mandate. So I may not be able to answer in any detail on those points.
Because I think, David, that's a key point, because we do get, as Trevor says, this is legislative assembly, and we do get criticised for not managing legislation. But the key question needs to be asked, it needs to be answered rather, is, is the department saying there wasn't enough time, or is the assembly saying they hadn't enough time? And I know you can't answer that. Maybe just going back to an earlier point, Dale, of yours as well there, when you talked about, is there any legal impediment for a child of compulsory school age attending a preschool setting?
Well, the legislation, that's not my area, so perhaps Heather may wish to comment as well. But we need to look at the legislation in the context, and not just in terms of Article 45 of the Education Order in 1986, but also the other preschool-specific legislation, which would largely be Heather's area. Heather, is there something that...
Yes, it might be helpful if I explain. The preschool education programme, it's targeted at children in their immediate preschool year. In terms of legislation, there are various definitions through various pieces of legislation. And if we look at definition of nursery school, nursery class, and children in legislation referring to preschool admission regulations, the upper age limit is having attained the lower limit of compulsory school age. So legislation at the moment for preschool education, the cut-off point is compulsory school age, which is defined as, I think, 4 years and 2 months. So that there would be a need to review that legislation.
Would there be a legal impediment for a child to spend a second year in nursery if they were, of compulsory school age? Would there be anything against that?
As I've explained, that's where the legislation sets the upper limit, is compulsory school age. So in terms of legislation, there would be an impediment from the preschool programme.
We have heard today about further guidance and so on in terms of clarifying the current legal position. When do you propose to get this information out to parents?
As we said, the question of the timing of producing that guidance will be one of the first issues that we need to address as we're working with the Education Authority and how that is produced.
Because, I'm thinking particularly of parents out there, and one in particular who knows her young son is young for his age and would benefit from another year at home. But because of really the inactivity of whoever, if they were living in Scotland or if they're living in the Republic of Ireland or at least, there would be a solution. There's no solution for that here. And the other point really, David, is it's tied to addressing our problems with numeracy and literacy and underachievement. Has any studies been done on children who are young for their age in terms of underachieving? I would sense there probably is a correlation between those two. Because I'm just thinking of this parent who knows her child very well, but saying he just needs another year at home to ensure that he's fit for school. And I've had personal experience of a daughter of mine who was ill and had to stay back a year in primary school at one stage, and it made some difference. So has there any work been done?
There's a range of research on a number of different questions. I think there is clearly evidence in respect of which month in the year a child is born and the difference that may make, and that declines over time. Clearly, at the beginning of primary school, there will be a difference, an observable difference very often between those who are very young in their year and those who are old in their year. But in actual fact, of course, that will always be the case wherever the line is drawn, because there will always be a range of at least 12 months between the oldest and the youngest in the class. So that is one issue, and that, the evidence would appear to show, actually declines over time. So it was very interesting getting, as it were, the anecdotal confirmation of that from young people at school in the sort of 16, 17 and 18, who are making the point that actually by that age, the month of birth really doesn't make a significant difference. The other piece of evidence, which curiously actually was published while the consultation was going on, was a study of data, actually coming from Germany, but the study was done in universities in the UK, around the impact of deferring the starting of primary school, where even where the decision has been taken on very solid evidence in the first instance, there is a continuing impact upon a child for being kept back a year, even at the beginning of schooling, that there would be a negative impact over time. That's one study, and I think the conclusion of that research is that more needs to be found out. So there is the evidence is inconclusive around what the impact would be of both insisting on an absolutely rigid set of arrangements that there will always be a 12-month span within each year group, or making arrangements to allow children to start a year later. I think a point that's worth making is that part of the question has to be, is it possible, and at what stage might it be possible, to make a decision that the foundation stage in a primary school is not as valuable as repeating the same provision in a preschool setting? And that's one of the tricky issues that needs to be needs to be brought out of any process, of any arrangement to allow for deferral of school.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Chair, on the back of, do you mind, when you answered Sean's first question, David, you said that well, you couldn't really answer it because you're from the policy side of the equation rather than the business management side. Given that the ministers expressed opinion that there was going to be a difficulty in bringing this legislation forward, and you might have thought, I would have thought, you might have thought that this is a question that was going to be raised at this particular meeting. Why is there nobody here from the business management side? I mean, it's so obvious that we would have been asking questions about timetabling, and you're telling us now that you can't talk about it, even though you've done your best.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we're here to brief you on the results of the consultation, which is why it's this particular combination. The question of Assembly business timetabling, I'm sure that you'll yourselves know the pressures that the scheduling of work for the Assembly in the last year of this mandate, how that has been being taken into consideration.
We have a business committee which decides the business is going to be brought before the House, but I'm talking about your business management, your departmental business management, which was your phrase.
But I was referring to the business management as far as the executive and the Assembly are concerned about the volume of business the Assembly is looking to over the coming 12 months.
You're still blaming the Assembly, and I'm blaming the department, frankly. If the Assembly was willing to include this work in its forward work programme with the intention of having it finalised before June 2016, could you not bring it forward?
My understanding is that there was a requirement to prioritise the legislation brought forward by the Department of Education, and the ministers decided that this isn't one of those pieces of legislation that he will prioritise. He has other pieces that he would bring forward first.
Thank you. Mr. Craig.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, but I do share the disappointment of others around this, because there's a lot of pressure coming from parents around this issue. I also share the disappointment of others in the length of time it has taken to actually get the consultation process completed. I do find 15 months quite a long period of time. The other issue that worries me about all of this, obviously as a committee we're not going to have a say in it whether the Minister brings this forward or not. That's his decision. But how much money and what sort of money we're talking about has been spent in this consultation process and by yourselves up until this point in time to something, bringing it to a point where literally little or nothing is going to happen. Guidelines is fine, but it's just going to reiterate what's already there.
I mean, I can't ask Dale to comment on how much the consultation exercise cost, for example. Again, I'd reiterate that there is still value in developing proposals to go to consultation, conducting consultation exercise, hearing the views of consultees, because that work then has been done. And if it then is a priority for the Minister subsequently, that work will have been done. There is an issue with the scheduling of legislation, which has meant that a pause can be placed on this, and it will be a decision for a Minister. But this work then has done. There will then be the consultation concluded, consultation responses on file, and it's not that it is completely nugatory, the work that has gone on to date. And again, I'd reiterate, it has proved to be a complex area, a much more complex area perhaps than any of us involved when we started had anticipated, and therefore it has taken time to work through some really quite considerable sort of issues that would need to be addressed in taking forward what would appear on the outset to be really quite a straightforward policy position.
In terms of the costs, Chair, engaging Parents NI and Play Board, for example, would be £8,000 on top of obviously our existing staffing costs to arrange meetings and decide on the detail of the consultation and so on, which took place over a number of months. But I can assure the committee that since I took up post in September last year, this was given to me as a priority, and it was conducted within 3 months of me taking up that post. So, I can't say that there's been any delay from my point of view. It has been seen as a priority since I was asked to take it on, and I think conducting it in that time period is testament to the seriousness with which the department takes this issue and wants it to continue. It's simply that there are other legislative priorities taking precedence within the department now. But happy to take forward the guidance, which I think will bear fruit in terms of the clarity that will provide for parents, including outlining in the very small number of circumstances that parents out loud seem to be interested in, which is where they're making private arrangements to overcome individual circumstances. So I think that can only be seen as a positive thing, bearing in mind the large amount of work that's been taken in, from my point of view, what is a very short period of time.
Is that you?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Suvrand?
Thank you, Chair. And thanks for your presentation, but I too share the frustrations of the committee regarding the delay that now seems inevitable for this legislation. I just have one question with regard to the consultation, and it really stems from a query that I received in the office regarding a parent who thought that their child was ready for school early, actually, rather than delayed. Their child was born July or August, and that wasn't taken into consideration in the consultation. Why was that? Why did you not ask that sort of question?
That actually did come up in a couple of conversations that we had with parents, and yes, it is really the other side of the spectrum, if you like. Yeah. It is a completely different issue in the sense that it's about, I guess, talented and gifted children, which in its own right would be a policy that we may wish to look at if that's a decision made by within the department. We do have a talented and gifted policy as things currently stand, and the existing circular, for example, that's referred to in the consultation 1996 of 24 refers to not just considering holding back a child for a year, for example, depending on how they progress through primary school, but also potentially promoting them by a year if they were talented and gifted as considered by the parent and in consultation with the principal and the board of governors. So there are ways in which those things can be taken into consideration. Whether that decision takes place prior to starting primary school or not, I'm probably not close enough to the detail to be able to answer that today, but certainly once in school, there are ways in which those sorts of issues can be considered.
And that's my understanding too. It's easier within school. I mean, I've seen children myself going on and progressing in the year ahead. But it's at that. I mean, this is about school starting age flexibility. When you tell a parent there's a review on starting age flexibility, well, you sort of think it takes both sides of it. So it's
interesting. I'm not sure that it was actually an issue that was raised during the consultation.
It was sort of around the
yes, the conversations may have happened, but
yeah, surely that should have been a question in the consultation.
We were very keen on getting the title of the consultation very accurate, and we took the title is the much longer one, which is Deferral of School Starting Age in Exceptional Circumstances. So you can interpret that then more narrowly as school starting age, which some parents chose to do, but that's not what was intended by the consultation.
Okay.
We can certainly look at it if it's an area of concern.
If it's going to be deferred, then it could be looked at. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
There's a deferral of the legislation as opposed to the start.
Yeah.
Can I thank you for your contribution this morning? And obviously you'll sense the frustration from members, particularly in relation to the blame game around the timetabling of all of this. We will follow this up with the Minister, but obviously want to see early sight of the guidance. So we may have this conversation again around that. So, but thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Okay, members, just with how we deal with this, are you content that we write to the Minister citing our frustration in relation to this, and obviously our disappointment in the timescales, because there did seem to be appropriate time when he contacted the committee in the first instance, and certainly when we'd looked at our commitment, and I know that at that stage we were being presented with 5 bills, and we felt that we could still do that comfortably within the time which was allowed to us before the end of the mandate. So I'm not sure that the reason which was being given is acceptable. But it falls down to clearly the priorities then of the Minister. But I think probably in the strongest terms that we relay that back, that we haven't had the opportunity to look at this. I suppose we do have to take into consideration perhaps it is more complex than first anticipated, but we haven't been given the luxury of being able to look at that. Mr. Lund.
Well, it may or may not be more complicated than what it appears. The only thing I would say, I agree right to the Minister, and as you said, in the strongest possible terms. I think we really have to make it clear to him that as you say, the blame game, it shouldn't be laid at our door. We're either, as a committee, prepared to accept our role in this, that we can progress the committee stage of this legislation, should it be brought forward before the end of the mandate. From what you say, we clearly could. Particularly as there's a certain amount of unanimity around the table in terms of what's required. You know, it doesn't sound to me, first of all, particularly complicated, and secondly, an issue where there's going to be enormous division. So I think our stage in this could be reasonably quick. If we could make that point to the Minister as we write to him as well, then he could find somebody else to blame.
Mr. Rogers.
I know, just agree with that. I say just total frustration that this has taken so long, and you know, I think it's been passed off as that it's from a legislation that we're incompetent, but I think that the incompetence lies someplace else.
We really don't have any detail around this either as to what the complexities are, so we're as much in the dark as anyone else. It looks like it could be an issue around administration, but or perhaps that's maybe the excuse which is being used. Mr. Kinahan?
Can we push for the guidance as well? I mean, we're sort of getting stymied. It's either legislation or guidance, but let's push for both.
And I suppose that the confusion that I have in relation to the guidance is that my understanding is that they can be done currently, but now they're getting renewed guidance. So how much of a delay is that going to cause? But absolutely, I think we need to push him on that. I had written to the Minister early in February around the 2 issues around what legislation was required, and also with regards to interim guidance, and other than a response to tell me that my correspondence had been put in with the consultation, which wasn't what it was supposed to do, or nor was it intended to be that, I didn't receive a substantive reply. So certainly we need to follow up on that with a degree of urgency, because obviously we're getting into the stage where September isn't too far away for children who will want to benefit from this, and parents who want to use it. Anyone else?
I just wonder, Chair, if there was ever any discussion with the Business Committee on the legislation, just for clarity, that's all.
Sorry,
check with the Business Committee as to whether they were consulted.
I understand, members, that, well, as members are aware, the Department did contact McClark with its, and indeed the Committee, with its draft legislative programme over 5 bills, and I'd indicated a timetable by which the 5 bills, which included this devil, could have been done and completed. I also understand that there has been conversations between the Assembly and the Executive about the legislative programme, and what they were keen to avoid was what happened the last time, which was a large number of bills in the last year, and members, not necessarily this committee but other committee, struggling with some very big legislation, trying to get that scrutinised in a reasonable time scale, like 100 clause bills and that kind of thing. And that as a consequence of that, the Executive has now decided to prioritise its legislative programme, so there have been conversations. I know that's happened.
Okay, Mr. Craig?
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. I thought it was interesting, to be honest with you, the lack of reply around how much this has all cost. It was also fascinating to hear how few people have actually worked on this. I think the committee needs to write to the department here as well, demanding a full cost breakdown and a manpower breakdown on the time spent on this, because I do get the impression that there has been a lot of heel dragging on this one, and the consultation period in particular is just ridiculously long. You know, I think it would be interesting to find out how many man hours were actually spent on this, what the overall cost to all of this was, and then I think we'll draw our own conclusions on who has brought this to the point where it can't be brought forward.
And it's just a small point, you know, this committee wasn't found wanting when we needed accelerated passage for the education bill. You know, I don't think we'll be found wanting again if we need accelerated passage to get this through.
Although I'm not sure we maybe want to indicate that at this stage without having seen sight of what the legislation is.
Oh, well, okay, but
I think we maybe need to be cautious in
we just
relation
really
to that,
need to-
because I don't think we want to give that type of flexibility to the department without having seen the proposals.
yeah, fair enough, but I think
I understand your point, but
it's really a follow-on from Jonathan's point. We need to see who's dragging the feet here,
yeah, I think that's right.
as parents and children get more frustrated.
Okay, members content?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Just moving then on to correspondence. There's 11 items from page 558 to 666. Are members content that we deal with the correspondence as detailed in the cover sheet? Unless there's something of particular interest that members want or wish to highlight?
Just on 9.6, when I look at that designation of St. Ronan's College, page 579, it was the point very much made by parents of children in the primary school that they weren't consulted, and here we see it. It was the 3 post-primary schools that the consultation took place with, not with children in the feeder primary school, which is very...
Again, I think we're going to send this on to parents for their consideration, obviously seeking feedback then from them as well.
Yeah.
We've been sending them information as we've been going along and as we've been receiving it. Any other issues that want to raise from correspondence? 9/11, we have the Youth Council. We have correspondence from the Minister enclosing a copy of the consultation document on subsuming the Youth Council for Northern Ireland into the Education Authority. The consultations on the discontinuation of YCNI with questions about targets and monitoring outcomes. The consultation will end on the 12th of June, and primary legislation will be required in order to do so. So it might be useful for us to write to the Minister just in relation to this to see what the relevant timescales are and whether or not he intends or whether he has the time to do that piece of legislation within this mandate. It might be useful for members given the conversation that we've just had. So members content then we deal with the correspondence and as discussed and as the cover note as indicated. Moving then to our draft forward work programme. Just copy this page 667 to 669. Next week's meeting is with ETI and DE and they'll brief us on the review of CRED plus the next steps for CRED, and DE will also brief us on the joint faith schools. So if you're content, and I'd also like an indication, if we can, with regards to our meeting at Derrygonnelly on the 10th of June. Can members indicate that they will be in attendance at that meeting? Because obviously we've had issue in the not so distant past where members have been unable to attend, but I'm also aware that this doesn't fall in within the Westminster election time frame, so can members indicate that they'll be able to attend Derrygonnelly on the 10th of June?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Lunn. And there's silence.
Where's Derrygonnelly exactly?
Might have been a Skillen.
Yeah, I thought it was Fermanagh.
Just before the Republic.
Yes, practically.
But can we ask if there'll be an email sent out? And if members can indicate back by the end of the week, it would be really useful, because obviously we need to confirm that we're going to have a quorum to have a meeting, but we also need to let
10th of June.
10th of June, let those who will be hosting us know whether.
All right, sure. It's just the reason I'm blank and silent here is Robin and myself are involved in the PCSP panel, so can't give you a cast iron guarantee around it, because there's some of them have moved dates.
Okay, so if you can at your earliest opportunity, if you can come back to Peter just to let him know. So
I'm planning to attend if you take that down.
so we have
you.
we have the regulars. We've got Trevor, Sandra, and myself. Okay, so can we just, if you're happy to endorse in the forward work programme, and do we have any other business at this stage?
No, thank you, Chair.
No. The date of the next meeting is Wednesday, 29th of April at 10 a.m. in the Senate chamber, and if members are content, we shall adjourn.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.